The story of Noah's Ark is, above all, a story of a perfect reset. It is a narrative of absolute endings and clean beginnings. We are told of a world so consumed by violence and corruption that its creator was forced to perform a radical act of cosmic sterilization. The Great Flood was not a partial cleansing. It was a total erasure. Every living thing on the face of the earth, the text of Genesis assures us, was wiped away. Only Noah, his family, and the creatures with him in the ark, the seeds of a new, purified world, survived. The slate was washed clean. But buried deep within the pages of the Old Testament, long after the waters receded and the rainbow sealed a new covenant, there is a verse that shatters this clean narrative. It is a single line that creates a paradox so profound. It has haunted theologians and scholars for millennia. In the book of Numbers, when the Israelite spies return from scouting the promised land of Canaan, they give a terrified report. They say, "We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Stop. The Nephilim, the very same hybrid giants, the offspring of the sons of God, whose existence was a primary catalyst for the flood, are back. How can this be? If the flood was a total reset, if every living thing outside the ark was destroyed, how did the giants return? How did this specific malignant genetic corruption survive a global divine purge? This is the post-flood paradox, a crack in the foundation of the biblical narrative that challenges the very integrity of the story. It is a question that cannot be easily dismissed. It suggests one of three possibilities. Either the flood was not as total as we have been led to believe, Noah's own family was somehow contaminated, or something else entirely happened to the giants, something about their fundamental nature that allowed their essence to persist beyond the destruction of their bodies. The silence of the canonical text on this matter is not a minor oversight. It is a clue that the true story of what happened to the giants is far stranger and far more terrifying than we have ever been told. Faced with the undeniable paradox of the giants' return, theologians and scholars have proposed a number of theories over the centuries, each attempting to patch this gaping hole in the narrative. These are sincere efforts to reconcile the text, but as we will see, each one falls short, failing to account for the full scope of the evidence. They are logical workarounds for a problem that is not, at its core, logical, but supernatural. The first and most common theory is that the Nephilim seen in Canaan were not literal descendants of the pre-flood giants, but simply very tall, intimidating people whom the spies, in their fear, were hyperbolically comparing to the legendary figures of old. This is a safe, rationalizing explanation, but it directly contradicts the text. The spies don't say the Canaanites were like the Nephilim. They say, "We saw the Nephilim there." The language is one of direct identification, not comparison. A second theory suggests that the genetic corruption survived the flood through one of Noah's daughters-in-law. Perhaps the wife of Ham carried a recessive Nephilim gene, which then re-emerged in his descendants, specifically in the line of Canaan. This is a more clever explanation, but it creates a profound theological problem. It implies that God's chosen vessel for preserving humanity, the Ark, was itself contaminated. It suggests that the divine reset was flawed from the very beginning, an idea that undermines the entire purpose of the judgment. A third theory proposes that the flood was not a global event, but a massive, localized catastrophe in Mesopotamia. This would allow for other giant populations in different parts of the world to have survived. While this solves the survival problem, it creates a new one by challenging the plain reading and the vast cosmic scale of the flood narrative as it is presented in Genesis. A final, more fringe theory suggests that there was a second, post-flood incursion of fallen angels, a repeat of the original sin of Genesis 6. But there is absolutely no textual evidence for such an event. The Bible is silent on any second fall. All of these theories share a common flaw. They are all desperately trying to explain how the physical bodies of the giants could have survived or been recreated. They are all stuck asking a biological and historical question. But what if that is the wrong question entirely? What if the key to the paradox lies not in the persistence of their flesh, but in the immortality of their spirits? Perhaps the real question isn't how the giants survived the flood. Perhaps it's what the flood transformed them into, to solve a mystery of this magnitude, a mystery that has stumped theologians for millennia and seems to defy the internal logic of the canonical text. We must expand our investigation. We must do what the ancient gatekeepers of history were so afraid of doing. We must summon the witnesses they exiled. To understand the true fate of the Nephilim, we must open the scrolls that contain the full, unredacted account of the cosmic war, the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These are not just supplementary texts to be read for historical curiosity. They are, in this case, the central exhibits in our investigation. They are the documents that claim to record the divine legal proceedings against the Watchers and their monstrous offspring. While Genesis gives us the public-facing summary of the flood event, these books provide the classified, behind-the-scenes legal and spiritual context. The Book of Enoch acts as the detailed transcript of the divine verdict, recording the exact sentences passed down upon the guilty parties. The Book of Jubilees acts as the official court record, placing that verdict within the larger legal framework of God's covenantal history. And when we open these ancient texts, we discover that they are almost entirely unconcerned with the question that has obsessed modern scholars: the physical survival of the giants. To the authors of these books, the fate of the Nephilim's bodies was a settled issue. They were drowned, destroyed, annihilated. Their focus is on a far more terrifying and urgent question. The very question we posed at the end of the last chapter: what happened to their spirits? These texts reveal that the Nephilim were a unique and tragic problem for the divine court. As beings who were half angelic and half human, their spirits could not ascend to heaven, nor could they be simply erased from existence like the souls of animals. They were a spiritual anomaly, a class of being that was never meant to exist, and the divine sentence pronounced upon them, a sentence so shocking it was systematically erased from the official record, does not just solve the paradox of the giants' return, it unlocks the hidden origin of the demonic realm itself. The Book of Enoch does not bury its most explosive revelation in cryptic language or vague metaphors. It declares it with the stark, terrifying clarity of a divine courtroom verdict. In the 15th chapter of the book, God speaks directly to the fallen Watchers through Enoch, and in doing so, he pronounces the eternal sentence upon their hybrid offspring. This is the forbidden testimony. First, God confirms the physical annihilation of the giants. He states that their bodies of flesh will perish in the great destruction. There is no ambiguity here. There are no survivors, no escapees hiding in mountain caves or underground bunkers. The physical threat of the Nephilim was dealt with decisively by the waters of the flood. But then, the verdict takes a chilling turn. God declares that because the giants were born of both spirit from their watcher fathers and flesh from their human mothers, their spiritual nature is fundamentally different from both angels and humans. And then comes the sentence that changes everything. And now, the giants, who are produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Let the weight of those words settle. The book of Enoch testifies that the disembodied immortal spirits of the dead Nephilim were condemned to remain on the earth. They were not to be imprisoned in the abyss with their angelic fathers, nor were they allowed to find rest. They were cursed to wander the earth as a spiritual plague, a host of malignant, bodiless entities. The text goes on to describe their nature with horrifying precision. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. This is it. This is the secret origin story that was erased from the Bible. The demons of the New Testament, the unclean spirits that Jesus confronted in the Gospels, are not, according to this ancient testimony, simply another category of fallen angel. They are the lingering, ghostly souls of the dead Nephilim. They are the tormented, disembodied spirits of the monstrous beings who once walked the earth, and their eternal rage is now directed at the human race from which their mothers came. The flood did not end the Nephilim problem. It merely transformed it, from a physical threat into a spiritual one. The verdict in the book of Enoch is a staggering revelation on its own. It provides a direct historical origin for the demonic spirits that plague humanity. But it also raises a profound and troubling theological question. If these spirits are so malignant, so destructive, why did a sovereign God permit them to remain on the earth after the flood? Why wasn't their spiritual threat neutralized at the same time as their physical one? The Book of Jubilees provides the answer, and it is a scene that is even more disturbing than the original verdict, a story of a divine courtroom negotiation. Jubilees chapter 10 recounts the events in the years immediately following the flood. Noah, witnessing his own grandchildren being tormented and led astray by these same lingering evil spirits of the giants, falls on his face and prays a desperate prayer. He pleads with God to capture and imprison all of these demonic entities, to cleanse the earth of their spiritual corruption, just as he had cleansed it of their physical bodies. And initially, God agrees. The text states that the Lord commanded his angels to bind them all. The great exorcism, the final cleansing, was about to happen. But then, the narrative takes a sinister turn. The chief of these spirits, a being Jubilees calls Prince Mastema, a name synonymous with the Satan of the New Testament, steps forward and makes a legal appeal directly to God. This is the forbidden testimony. Mastema argues that if God imprisons all of the demonic spirits, he, Mastema, will have no power left with which to corrupt, lead astray, and destroy mankind. he makes a chilling legal argument that his very purpose to test and accuse humanity requires him to have a subordinate army. He essentially petitions the court for a workforce. And then comes the most shocking moment in the entire story. God, in his inscrutable sovereignty, grants the appeal, at least in part. He commands the archangels to bind 9/10 of the demonic spirits and cast them into the place of condemnation. But he allows Prince Mastema to retain authority over the remaining 1/10, to keep them on earth as his agents of temptation and affliction until the final day of judgment. This is a truth of almost unbearable weight. It means that the presence of demons on earth is not an accident, nor is it a sign of God's weakness. It is a result of a direct, divine, and permissive decree. The spiritual war we find ourselves in is not a chaotic free-for-all. It is a legally sanctioned conflict, operating under specific, divinely established rules of engagement. The enemy has been given a quota. Now you understand why this story had to be erased. It is one of the most theologically challenging narratives in all of ancient literature. It presents a God who, for his own sovereign purposes, knowingly allows a force of pure evil to remain active in his creation. It removes the comfortable distance between God's will and the reality of demonic suffering. The gatekeepers, faced with this terrifying vision of divine sovereignty, chose a simpler, safer silence. They hid the story of Mastema's bargain, and in doing so, they hid from us the true, legal, and terrifying reason why the war is still raging. The testimonies of Enoch and Jubilees, describing demons as the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim who operate under a divine permissive decree, might seem like a strange, alien theology to those familiar only with the Old Testament. But when we open the pages of the New Testament, we find that the world Jesus and the apostles operated in is perfectly described by this very framework. The behavior of the demons in the Gospels makes little sense in a vacuum, but it becomes perfectly coherent when viewed through the lens of their Enochian origin. Consider the famous account of the demon-possessed man of the Gerasenes. When Jesus confronts the legion of spirits inhabiting him, their first reaction is terror. But what are they afraid of? They cry out, "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" This is a bizarre statement. Unless you know the full story, they are referencing the very verdict recorded in the book of Enoch. They know their ultimate fate is to be imprisoned in the abyss with their watcher fathers. But they also know that this final judgment is not supposed to happen until the appointed time. They are terrified that Jesus, the cosmic judge, is about to override the established timeline. Then comes their desperate plea. They beg Jesus not to send them out of the country or into the abyss. Instead, they plead to be sent into a herd of pigs. Why? Because as disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, their deepest torment is their bodilessness. They crave a physical host. This is not just a random act of malice. It is an expression of their fundamental nature, a nature perfectly explained by Enoch. They would rather inhabit the unclean bodies of swine than endure the torment of being disembodied spirits in the wilderness. This framework illuminates countless other details in the Gospels. It explains why demons are consistently referred to as unclean spirits, a term that resonates with their corrupted hybrid origin. It explains their connection to places of death and desolation, like tombs, the natural haunting grounds for the spirits of the dead. It explains their ability to inflict physical disease, a lingering expression of the destructive power they wielded when they had bodies of their own. The world of the New Testament is not a world of generic fallen angels. It is a world haunted by the ghosts of the Nephilim. Jesus did not just come as a teacher. He came as the ultimate exorcist, the one with the authority to command these ancient, malignant spirits. The apostles and the early church understood this. They lived in this reality. The gatekeepers who later edited the canon did not erase this reality from the New Testament. They couldn't, but by removing its Old Testament origin story in Enoch and Jubilees, they left us with a powerful but contextless account of a spiritual war whose true beginning they had deliberately chosen to hide. With the forbidden origin of demons now established, we can finally return to the paradox that began our investigation, the reappearance of physical giants in the land of Canaan after the flood. The common theories a flawed ark, a second angelic incursion are weak and lack textual support. But the Enochian framework provides a new and far more insidious possibility. What if the post-flood giants were not the result of a new act of hybridization, but a direct consequence of the ongoing activity of the newly created demonic realm? Consider the mechanics of the spiritual world we have uncovered. We have a host of powerful, disembodied Nephilim spirits whose primary torment is their lack of a physical form and whose primary goal is to afflict humanity. We also know, from both the Bible and ancient texts, that these spirits can possess, influence, and manipulate human beings. This leads to a chilling hypothesis. What if these powerful, ancient spirits, the ghosts of the giants, could do more than just cause sickness or madness? What if, by possessing or influencing a specific human bloodline over generations, they could begin to manipulate and corrupt that lineage's physical DNA? What if they could trigger latent genetic markers or cause epigenetic changes that would, over time, begin to reproduce the very gigantism that characterized their own former bodies? This theory suggests that the post-flood giants, the Anakim, the Rephaim, and Goliath himself, were not the result of new angels mating with women. They were the result of demonic possession and generational genetic manipulation. The corruption was no longer coming from the outside in. It was working from the inside out. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim were, in effect, attempting to rebuild their own physical forms by hijacking and twisting human bodies. This would explain why the command to utterly destroy these giant clans in the Old Testament was so absolute. It was not an act of simple ethnic cleansing. It was a command to perform a spiritual and genetic fumigation. The Israelites were not just fighting tall warriors. They were fighting a demonic infestation that had taken root in the very DNA of the people of Canaan. This is a far more terrifying reality than a simple second fall of angels. It suggests that the enemy's strategy had evolved. He no longer needed to send his angels. He could now use his army of earthbound demon spirits to continue his ancient project of corrupting the human race from within. The reappearance of the giants was not a sign that the flood had failed. It was a sign that the war had simply entered a new and far more intimate phase. The story of hybrid beings, their destruction, and their lingering spiritual influence is not a uniquely Judeo-Christian concept. When we cast our investigative net wider into the foundational myths and legends of cultures across the globe, we find the same story being told over and over, albeit through a different cultural lens. These are not borrowed tales. They are the fragmented, shared memories of a universal, prehistoric trauma. Consider the mythology of ancient Greece, the stories of the Titans, a race of powerful, semi-divine beings who ruled the earth before the Olympian gods, are well known. But less known is what happened to the offspring of the gods and mortals, the demigods and heroes, like Heracles or Perseus. In many traditions, after their physical deaths, the spirits of these powerful, half-human beings did not simply go to the underworld. They became daimons, a Greek word from which we get our word demon. These were powerful, intermediary spirits, neither fully gods nor fully mortal, who could interact with, influence, and sometimes possess human beings. This is a startlingly precise parallel to the Enochian account of the Nephilim spirits. Look to ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in the world, speaks of its hero, Gilgamesh, as being 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a clear reference to a hybrid being of immense power. The Sumerian and Babylonian pantheons are filled with stories of minor deities, monsters, and spirits born from the union of gods and mortals who continue to meddle in human affairs, travel across the world to the Americas. The ancient legends of the Maya and the Aztec speak of a previous creation of humanity that was destroyed by a great flood because they had angered the gods. The myths of many Native American tribes are filled with accounts of races of giants who were both powerful and corrupt, and whose malevolent spirits are still believed to haunt specific mountains and valleys. This global pattern is not a coincidence. It is the signature of a shared, deeply traumatic memory. The specific names change: Nephilim, Titans, daimons, but the core components of the story remain the same. A primordial time when divine and human realms intersected. The creation of a powerful, hybrid race. A catastrophic event, often a flood that destroyed their physical bodies. The persistence of their spiritual essence as powerful and often dangerous, spirits that continue to influence the world. These global myths are the scattered, fossilized remains of the same historical event that Enoch and Jubilees record with such clarity. They are the corroborating testimony from the rest of the human family, a collective whisper from across the ages that a great and terrible crime was committed at the dawn of time, and that we are still living with its ghostly consequences. With the evidence from Enoch, Jubilees, the New Testament, and global mythology converging, the case is clear. The Nephilim were not just giants, they were the genetic origin of the demonic realm. The flood did not end the threat, it transformed it. The key question, then, is why this foundational truth was erased from the Bible we hold today. The culprits were not ancient shepherds or prophets. They were the demon simplifiers, the theologians, scribes, and church fathers of the post-apostolic era. As Christianity began to spread and seek acceptance in the Greco-Roman world, It faced an existential challenge: how to present a faith that was both profound and intellectually respectable in a culture steeped in sophisticated Greek philosophy. The problem was that the Enochian cosmology, a world of watchers, hybrid giants, and disembodied spirits, was too messy. To the Greek philosophical mind, it sounded like crude, mythological folklore, similar to the myths of Zeus and the Titans. To the demon Simplifiers, these concepts were a distraction from the core message of a single, rational, sovereign God. They needed to streamline the theology, making it less supernatural and more rational. Their solution was a systematic process of demystification. They needed to present evil as a purely theological problem, a rebellion of free will, rather than a physical and historical reality of spiritual beings breeding with humans. They shifted the origin of demons away from the strange, biological account of the Nephilim. They simplified the story by focusing solely on Lucifer's rebellion. In this new, tidier narrative, all evil spirits became simply fallen angels, beautiful, celestial beings who chose pride over obedience. This version of the story was far more palatable to the rational mind. It was a clean, philosophical explanation: angels sinned and were cast out. But in their simplification, they committed an act of profound censorship. They obscured the true nature of the demonic forces. They erased the fact that the demons Jesus confronted were the ghost-like spirits of the dead giants. They removed the intelligence briefings on the enemy's origins, leaving the church strategically blind. The demon Simplifiers were not acting out of malice, but out of a misguided desire to make the faith more intellectually palatable. They sacrificed historical and spiritual truth for the sake of philosophical convenience. But the legacy of their censorship is a church that is often disarmed, fighting a spiritual war with a sanitized, incomplete understanding of its enemy's true identity. They hid the truth that the Nephilim never truly died. They just went spiritual. The erasure of the Enochian origin of demons was a significant act of censorship in itself, but the decision to also hide the story of Mastema's bargain, as recorded in the Book of Jubilees, had an even more profound and unsettling legacy. It didn't just change our understanding of the enemy, it fundamentally altered our understanding of the rules of the war. By removing the account of Mastema's negotiation with God, the gatekeepers created a simpler, more black and white picture of the spiritual world. In this edited version, God is all good, demons are all evil, and they are in a state of total, unregulated conflict. This is a comforting and straightforward narrative. But the full story from Jubilees introduces a far more complex and terrifying reality. It reveals that the presence of evil on earth is not just a result of a rebellion that God is tolerating. It is a legally sanctioned, divinely permitted reality. The 1/10 of the demonic host that remains on earth is not a rogue force of escaped prisoners. They are a paroled army, a task force operating with the explicit, albeit limited, permission of the cosmic judge. This is a truth that shatters our simplistic categories. It presents a God who, for his own sovereign and inscrutable purposes, chooses to use the very forces of evil as an instrument of testing and judgment upon humanity. It means that the spiritual war we are in is not a chaotic street brawl. It is a highly regulated legal conflict. with established rules of engagement. Mastema and his forces are not outlaws. They are the sanctioned prosecuting attorneys of the heavenly court, given the authority to test the faithfulness of the accused. The legacy of concealing this bargain is a faith that is often theologically naive about the nature of divine sovereignty and the problem of evil. We ask, why does a good God allow bad things to happen as if it were a sign of his weakness or absence? The Book of Jubilees answers with a chilling counter-narrative. He allows them because they serve a purpose within his larger cosmic plan. The demon Simplifiers hid this story because it was too difficult, too challenging to our comfortable notions of a benevolent God. They chose to present a God who is simply opposed to evil, rather than a God who is so sovereign he can bend even the most evil of intentions to serve his own ultimate redemptive ends. In doing so, they gave us a more comfortable faith, but they stole from us a more awesome, terrifying, and ultimately a more biblical understanding of the absolute sovereignty of God. The cumulative effect of erasing both the origin of demons and the legal framework for their operation has been a profound weakening of our ability to understand the New Testament, especially the ministry of Jesus. The gatekeepers who performed this censorship on the ancient texts left the Gospels intact, but they stripped them of their essential backstory. They left us with a powerful drama, but hid the script for the first act. And so, we read the New Testament in a state of historical amnesia. We witnessed Jesus performing exorcisms, and we are amazed. But we don't fully grasp the cosmic significance of what is happening. When Jesus confronts the legion of demons in the Gerasene demoniac, we see a miracle. But we fail to understand that he is confronting the very same ancient disembodied Nephilim spirits that once corrupted the entire world. His is not just an act of healing, it is an act of cosmic warfare, a reclaiming of territory from an ancient occupying force. When the demons cry out in terror, "Have you come to torture us before the appointed time?" we are left puzzled by the phrase, but with the Enochian context, we understand perfectly they are referring to the final judgment when they will be cast into the abyss with their Watcher fathers. They know who Jesus is, the cosmic judge, and they are terrified that he is about to fast forward the prophetic timeline. When they beg to be sent into a herd of pigs rather than the abyss, we see a strange request, but with the knowledge that they are the bodiless spirits of the giants, we understand their desperation. Their greatest torment is their disembodied state, and they crave any physical host, no matter how debased. By removing the foundational texts of Enoch and Jubilees, the gatekeepers have turned the spiritual warfare of the New Testament into a series of disconnected, almost folkloric events. We are left with a context-free account of a war, unaware of who the enemy is, where they came from, or what the rules of engagement are. The ministry of Jesus is subtly reduced from a strategic military campaign against an ancient foe to a series of compassionate but isolated miracles. The legacy of this censorship is a faith that has lost the plot. We know we are in a spiritual battle, but we have been denied the intelligence reports that would allow us to understand its full scope and history. We have been given the story of the victory, but we have been forbidden from reading the full account of the war that made that victory so necessary and so profound. The censorship of the ancient scribes was remarkably effective within the narrow confines of the biblical canon. They successfully erased the names and the explicit history of the Watchers and the Nephilim. But a truth this monumental, a trauma this profound, cannot be completely erased from the memory of humanity. It leaves echoes. It leaves fingerprints. And we find those echoes scattered across the globe, carved in stone, and preserved in the myths of cultures that had no direct contact with the Hebrew scriptures. Consider the megalithic structures that dot our planet. The massive, precision-cut stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 1,000 tons. The impossible angles and interlocking blocks of Puma Punku in Bolivia. The sheer, inexplicable scale of the pyramids of Egypt. Mainstream history struggles to explain these architectural marvels, often attributing them to primitive peoples with primitive tools, a solution that defies both logic and physics. But what if these structures are not the work of early humans alone? What if they are the lingering physical evidence, the architectural fossils, of the very beings the Book of Enoch describes, a race of giant, hybrid beings, possessing the supernatural knowledge of their angelic fathers? In this light, these megaliths are not mysteries, they are testaments. They are the silent, stone witnesses to the reality of a lost chapter in our history, a time when giants literally walked the earth. The memory was also preserved in myth. The stories are shockingly consistent across cultures. The ancient Greeks told of the Titans, a race of powerful divine beings who were cast into the underworld of Tartarus, a subterranean prison that is a startling parallel to the abyss described in Enoch. They also told of the demigods, the heroic, often violent offspring of gods and mortal women. The Sumerian tablets, which predate the Book of Genesis, speak of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, a race of divine beings who intermarried with humans and created hybrid rulers. Hindu mythology is filled with accounts of the Asuras and Devas, divine and demonic beings locked in an eternal war, and their interactions with humanity. These are not isolated fantasies. They are the fragmented, culturally translated memories of the same core event, a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were breached, when powerful supernatural beings intervened in human affairs, producing a race of destructive hybrids, and culminating in a catastrophic judgment. The gatekeepers may have erased the official report from the Bible, but they could not erase the memory from the soul of humanity. And so we arrive at a critical juncture in our investigation. The evidence is on the table. We have the redacted report from Genesis, with its cryptic reference to the sons of God. We have the full, unabridged testimony from the exiled witnesses, Enoch and Jubilees, who name the Watchers, detail their crimes, and reveal the demonic origin of their offspring. We have the corroborating evidence from the New Testament, where the behavior of demons perfectly matches their Enochian profile, and we have the echoes of this story reverberating through the stone monuments and foundational myths of the entire world. The choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient demon Simplifiers. For centuries, their edited version of the story was the only one available, but the buried evidence has been unearthed. The silenced voices are speaking again, and the power to decide which version of reality to accept now rests with you. You can choose to remain in the safe, tidy world that the gatekeepers constructed. You can continue to see demons as a vague, abstract concept, a generic term for fallen angels, with no specific origin or history. You can continue to see the spiritual battle as a simple conflict between good and evil, a philosophical struggle with no names, no faces, and no clear backstory. Or you can choose to accept the full, unredacted intelligence report. You can choose to look your enemy in the eye. This is not a choice to embrace a more complicated myth. It is a choice to embrace a more coherent and biblically grounded history. It is a choice to understand that the evil we face is not an abstract concept, but a specific and ancient foe with a name, a history, and a clear motive. To know the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim is to move from fighting in the dark to fighting in the light. It is to understand the why behind the spiritual war we are in. The gatekeepers offered you a simplified faith, believing you were not ready for the full, terrifying truth. Now, you have the opportunity to prove them wrong. The choice is yours. Will you continue to fight a nameless enemy, or will you dare to learn the name of the foe that was erased from your briefing? To learn the forbidden origin of demons is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a profound act of spiritual rearmament. It is a declaration that you are no longer content to live in the demystified, sanitized version of reality that was curated for you. It is a choice to see the world as the biblical authors, the apostles, and Jesus himself saw it as a battlefield in an ancient, ongoing cosmic war. This knowledge is not meant to inspire fear, but to foster a sober and strategic vigilance. When you understand that the source of demonic influence is not some abstract evil, but the lingering, hungry ghosts of a hybrid race, the nature of temptation and spiritual oppression becomes terrifyingly clear. You begin to understand the enemy's obsession with the human body, with physical corruption, and with the perversion of the created order. This is the invitation to begin rereading your Bible and your world through this restored, ancient lens. See the command to destroy the giant clans in Canaan not as a cruel act of genocide, but as a necessary act of spiritual fumigation. See the exorcisms performed by Jesus not just as miracles of healing, but as strategic victories, acts of liberation that reclaim human territory from an ancient occupying force. Let this truth change the way you pray. Your prayers against evil are no longer aimed at a vague, shadowy concept. They are aimed at a specific historical enemy with a known origin and a predictable nature. Let this truth change the way you view sin. It is not just a moral failure, it is an act that can open a door, an invitation to ancient predatory spirits who are constantly seeking a foothold. The gatekeepers hid this truth because they feared it would complicate the faith. But the reality is that it clarifies everything. It provides the missing context that makes the entire biblical narrative, from the flood to the final judgment, a single coherent story of a war and a victory. To acknowledge this battlefield is the first step toward living as a more effective soldier in the army of light. The question we began with was simple: what happened to the giants during the flood? The answer, as we have discovered, is far more terrifying and profound than we could have imagined. Their bodies were destroyed, yes, but the flood did not end the Nephilim threat. It merely transformed it. It turned a physical, visible enemy into a spiritual, invisible one. The greatest and most successful act of censorship in history was not hiding the evidence of giant bones. It was erasing the origin story of demons. The story of the Watchers and the Nephilim is not a mythological footnote to the Bible. It is the missing first act of the great cosmic drama. It is the secret that explains the context for the flood. The true nature of the enemy Jesus confronted, and the stakes of the spiritual war we are still fighting today. The gatekeepers, the demon simplifiers, in their desire for a tidier, more rational faith, gave us a story with a crucial chapter ripped out. But the exiled witnesses, Enoch and Jubilees, have returned from the dust of the desert caves and the faithful libraries of Ethiopia to restore the full, unredacted account. And now you have heard their testimony. You can no longer be content with the simplified story. You know that the war is older, the enemy is stranger, and the story is grander than you were ever told. This is not a call to fear, it is a call to clarity. The flood did not end the war, it simply changed the battlefield. Welcome to the unabridged, uncensored, and ongoing war against the ghosts of the giants.